Okay, and we're live. We've got a very special show for you today. I'm a big fan of our guest. He has an incredible YouTube channel called Sulha, which platforms all kinds of voices inside and outside the Israel-Palestine narrative. But for me, I'm particularly interested in the conversations that relate to Zionism, to Israel, and to the Palestinians. And it's Adar Weinreb. So Adar, first and foremost, thank you so much for being part of this show. The reason you're here is we have maybe a mutual friend who you had on your show, Mordechai. And I was really enjoying the conversation between you and Mordechai, who is he describes himself as a settler. I believe he has smicha, but he doesn't identify as a rabbi. Really interesting guy. He actually helped me identify hashkafa, Jewish philosophy, which I really relate to in the Geonic, Maimonidean tradition. So I was listening to the conversation between the two of you, and really something that you said really jarred with my understanding of the conflict. So when you were conversing with them, and I think it's first important to introduce you as clearly pro-Israel. I believe you're living in Tel Aviv. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you were born outside of Israel and moved to Israel, made Aliyah. And you described what happened in 1948 as ethnic cleansing. And so I invited you onto the show to have a conversation about your take on how Israel came into existence. Was it a state that was born in sin? Was it in terms of expulsions, ethnic cleansing, genocide, hard words? And I know I only heard you use the ethnic cleansing word, but I'm throwing in those words that others use because I think it's a really important conversation for those who identify as being pro-Israel, Zionist, to have, because there are different narratives. There are conflicting narratives as to what happened. Now, I imagine there's a lot of common ground, and I'd like to really focus on a lot of that common ground, but I'd also like to talk around those areas where we maybe have a different perspective. And so first and foremost, thank you so much for coming on the show. If you'd just like to take a few minutes just to introduce yourself, tell them where they can find your incredible content. As I was saying before you joined the show, yours is one of the only podcasts I religiously subscribe to. I enjoy all the conversations, whether I agree with the guests or disagree with the guests. I think it's a great platform. So if you could introduce yourself, tell people where they can find your platform, a little bit about the platform, that'd be really a great start.
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me, Joseph. It's great being here with you on this discussion. You know, a lot of advocacy pages, they would prefer to stay comfortably in their own echo chamber. So I commend you for bringing on somebody with a vastly different perspective than you, so we can actually discuss our differences. I think most advocacy pages wouldn't do this. So thank you. So my name is Adar Weinreb. As you mentioned, I did grow up in the United States to an Israeli father and an American mother. I made Aliyah at age 18, served in the IDF, and have lived in Israel ever since. That's been 13 years now. I no longer live in Tel Aviv. I recently moved to the Galilee, the beautiful northern Israel. My YouTube channel and project is called Sulha. In English, that's Sulha. You could find us on all the social media platforms. Our main platform is YouTube, and really our goal is just to aid in the reconciliation process between Israelis and Palestinians. It's clear to me that in order for us to make progress in this conflict and find a just and lasting solution, we need to begin having these conversations. Most Israelis don't know any Palestinians. Most Palestinians don't know any Israelis, aside from the soldiers that they meet, and they don't have positive encounters with them. Us having these dialogues is trying to break down that psychological barrier that currently exists between us. And in our a year plus of being around, we feel like we've had a great impact. We get emails on a weekly basis from people saying they've been transformed from discovering our content, from learning about the other side.
And I think just before we jump into the areas we disagree, I'd love to hear some of those stories. Like, who is it that's reaching out to you and saying that actually you've changed the narrative? Is it people in the Zionist camp, in the anti-Zionist camp, in the neutral camp? Who are those people that are getting in touch?
So both, and this is kind of how I measure progress, to see that it's both. So I got an email from a 15-year-old Jewish boy living in Haifa a few months ago saying that discovering this channel really opened his eyes, and he had to rearrange how he views and understands the conflict, and he watches almost every episode now. A Palestinian woman reached out to me telling me that she used to think Zionism was akin to Nazism, but now she understands that Zionists are just people too. So these are the kinds of emails. And when it comes to getting praise from both sides, I also get criticism from both sides, and I also view that as a positive. If I was only getting critiqued from the pro-Israel camp or only critiqued from the pro-Palestine camp, then I would question my approach and bias. But it seems like the praise and the hate comes from both sides, so all good.
So hopefully following this conversation, you'll be getting a lot more praise than hate. Hopefully you change some of my positions. Hopefully you change some of our guest positions, and vice versa. Hopefully you come away with something that you didn't have before this conversation. So I think maybe we just jump straight into the big question, which is, was Israel born in sin? And it's very Christian language, but I think it underpins a lot of the hostility or the support for the Zionist cause. Is like, how did Israel come into existence? And you used the term ethnic cleansing, which for me was it was an uncomfortable word to hear, because ethnic cleansing on any compass is way on the immoral side. It's not a good thing. And so I'd like you just to talk me through
Sure.
Was Israel born in sin?
Sure. So first, I'd like to give like a quick prelude that I think will help the audience hear this conversation with an open mind. I think in general, we have an innate need to assess who the good guy and who the bad guy is in every conflict. Some conflicts clearly have a good guy and a bad guy, but often, as with the Israel-Palestine conflict, it's a bit too complex to just conclude that it's good versus bad. In reality, you had two groups of people who were acting in their perceived best interests, and their destinies collided with one another. We're both evil in each other's narratives, and we're both great in our own. I want us to break out of this good versus bad thinking and just understand that it is way too complex to approach it that way. Also, you're going to hear me be very critical of Israel, but I'm in no way anti-Israel. I actually consider being critical of Israel as helping Israel improve as a nation. And I think it's essential for us to understand our role and responsibility in Palestinian grievances if we have any chance at reconciling with them. So I'd like the viewers to keep that in mind. Was Israel born in sin? I think to a great extent it was. I think it's not hard to understand why Jews wanted to return home after 2,000 years in a place where we could be safe after the Holocaust and hundreds of years of persecution all over the world. So we should be able to empathize with the Zionist narrative. But if we look at it from the perspective of the Palestinians, they see that suddenly these European-looking folks show up one day, speaking a different language, generally lighter skinned than them, dressed in European garb, speaking European languages, and not coming and treating them with respect. Right? There wasn't a lot of mutual respect from the Zionists to the local Palestinians living here. To them, this was viewed as just classic colonialism, right? This was when the world was ripe of colonialism. We were supported by other colonial powers like England. So to Palestinians, we were nothing other than a colonial force. And we didn't come and approach it and say, let's work with the Palestinians. Let's build the homeland together. Let's work together. We have resources from Europe. We could get the international community to support us. It will be a beautiful binational state. That was not our approach. Our approach was saying we have a right to this land and it will be exclusively Jewish. That doesn't mean that we can't have any Palestinian inhabitants, but it will be a Jewish state. It shouldn't be hard for us to understand why Palestinians would not accept this. We would not have accepted this if we were in their shoes. We didn't accept it when the Romans or any other conquerors came to this land. We actually were violent towards them. But we use the Palestinian violence towards us as a justification to everything we've ever done towards them. We often say that we're held to the highest standard of them all, and in many ways, we do get a disproportionate amount of attention. But the standard we hold Palestinians to, in many ways, is a higher standard than we would hold ourselves to, because we've seen that Jews living on this land responded to outside forces with violence. We would not have accepted a partition of the land and given a land to people perceived as outsiders who wanted a piece of it to be exclusively for them. So given all this, given who we are in the Palestinian narrative, given that the conflict between us resulted in the expulsion of 50% of them from their homes, still today cannot return, no compensation for the loss of property. The fact that the remaining Palestinians are still living under another nation's military rule. And again, that the common narrative is, yeah, but this is defensive. We need the military to be there. To an extent, I agree. There's a need for military presence in the West Bank, but so much of what we've done the past 70 plus years has not helped us reduce military presence. It's only helped us increase it. We don't value the well-being of Palestinians to nearly the same extent as we value our own well-being. So looking at really who we've been in the Palestinian narratives, looking at the fact that we did not come and try to do this with the Palestinians, I'd say there's a strong case to be made that Israel was born in sin. Does that mean Israel doesn't have a right to exist? No, we do have a right to exist. As we've seen, many nations were born in sin. They still have a right to exist. And I think the sooner we can come to terms with our problematic past, we can move and have conversations about the present and the future, which is more important.
Okay, so yeah, as I imagine, there's a ton of things we disagree with, but I think it's really important to have these conversations. And I think one of the things you opened with was that within a conflict, some conflicts you have a party which is entirely evil and a party which is, let's not use the term good, but let's use the term the victim of that aggression. And so Jews, Nazi Germany is a great example of where you have a victim and an aggressor. And with the exception of a few neo-Nazis, you'll find very few people sympathizing with the Nazi cause. I think the language of the, let's say, the pre-48 leaders of what their intentions were don't marry up to what you are saying. I think you had a party whose intentions were evil, and you had a party whose intentions were survival, existence, but quite happily coexistence. And so when you look at the language of all of the leaders of the Muslim world at that time, their language was far harsher than the language of the Zionist leaders. So when you have Hajamin al-Husseini, who was the leader of the Palestinian people during 48 and before, when he declared, I declare a jihad, my Muslim brothers, murder the Jews, murder them all. There was no equivalent quote on the Jewish side. When you had Ibn Saud, who was the leader in the Hijaz of Arabia, which then became Saudi Arabia, when you had him saying there are 50 million Arabs, what does it matter if we lose 10 million people to kill all the Jews? The price is worth it. When you had the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan al-Banna, saying all Arabs shall arise and annihilate the Jews, we shall fill the sea with their corpses. When you had Azam Pasha, the General Secretary of the Arab League, saying this will be a war of extermination, a momentous massacre which will be spoken of like the Mongolian massacres and crusades. This is the language of genocide. But then on the flip side, what were the Jewish leaders saying? So you had Chaim Weizmann saying in 1925, Palestine must be built up without violating the legitimate interests of the Arabs. Not a hair of their heads shall be touched. When you had Ben-Gurion saying, in the Jewish state, Jews will not have any right that's denied to Arabs, Greeks, or Armenians. If they are residents and citizens of the state, every citizen, Jewish, Arab, or any other, will be eligible to be elected to be president, prime minister, justice of the High Court, etc. And this is what we see today. And so I think first and foremost, the framing of these as two parties with national interests which are distinct but not necessarily different, I think is an incorrect framing of the very conflict. The language that the leaders took before the war broke out reflects their intentions. And you can look at that to this day. What is the language of the Zionist side has continuously been yes to partition, yes to peace. At least, and there are many Zionist leaders who didn't believe in two-state solution, but the outward expression to the broader world has always been yes to two states. And we've said yes to almost every peace proposal that was on the table, where it has been rejected for numerous reasons, almost every time by the Arabs. And so I think first and foremost, your framing of the conflict is maybe where we disagree. We can get into what happened after 47, after the Civil War broke out, and 48, when the War of Independence, which I would assume, given your language thing that you're saying this is a nation that is born in sin, I would assume you would see it as the Nakba. You would see it as the catastrophe, because the language that you're using, of ethnic cleansing, of born in sin, would, if I saw it that way, I would also agree this is a catastrophe, not just for the Palestinians, but for the Jews as well, for the Zionists as well, if it is as you describe. But I don't believe it is as you describe. So I've spoke for a while, so I'll allow you to respond to some of the things I've said.
Sure. So first, a little bit about framing. Being able to point at all the horrible things that Palestinians or Muslims have done or said should not absolve us of our responsibility or our wrongdoing. So I view this in a sense as a deflection. And often it's harder for us to view values as a collective for some reason, but let's talk about it as an individual. If an individual refuses to take responsibility because they could point to somebody who just acted much worse, that to most people, they'd see that as a sign of emotional immaturity. They'd be like, okay, this person's just deflecting blame, trying to point fingers, not taking responsibility for their wrongdoing. So we could have a conversation of all the bad stuff Palestinians and Muslims have done, and we'd probably agree on most of that. But for me, that shouldn't take away from us looking within and understanding where we've gone wrong. You brought up a few quotes, and Ben-Gurion's an interesting person to quote, because he has way more quotes supporting compulsory transfer, or call it population transfer, or ethnic cleansing. He very much was one of the main leaders of spreading the idea of population transfer. And I could start reading quotes by Ben-Gurion. I have a whole bunch of them. You want to hear a few?
Yeah, it's only fair.
Ben-Gurion in 1944, Zionism is a transfer of the Jews. Regarding the transfer of the Arabs, this is much easier than any other transfer. There are Arab states in the vicinity, and it is clear that if the Arabs are removed, this will improve their condition and not the contrary. So that's him thinking it would be good for them. In 1938, he goes, I support compulsory transfer. I don't see in it anything immoral. Okay. He continues that quote to say that he thinks it would need to be done by the British, though. In 1936.
Just to that point, what was that in relation to? Because I would imagine that's in relation to the 37 Peel Commission, when the British proposed. It was the British that proposed population transfer.
For sure, and he agreed. He said he sees nothing immoral in it. And it's very important to understand there's a very strong ideology of population transfer leading up to 1948. So all the Zionist leaders from top to bottom had an idea that population transfer would be needed. I'll continue with another quote. 1937, Ben-Gurion, in many parts of the country, new settlement will not be possible without transferring the Arab Faraqim. It is important that this plan comes from the British Peel Commission, not from us. Jewish power, which grows steadily, will also increase our possibilities to carry out the transfer on a large scale. You must remember that this system embodies an important humane and Zionist idea to transfer parts of a people to their country and to settle empty lands. We believe that this action will also bring us closer to an agreement with the Arabs. So here, this is 37. You see that it's like a moderate view. He's saying we'll do it through the Peel Commission. It'll be good for them. But as we get closer to 48, you'll see how the ideology was kind of strengthened, and we acknowledge that it should probably come from us. 1948, this was already when the fighting began. From your entry into Jerusalem through Lifta Romema, which is an East Jerusalem Palestinian neighborhood, there are no Arabs, 100% Jews. Since Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans, it has not been Jewish as it is now. In many Arab neighborhoods in the West, one sees not a single Palestinian Arab. I do not assume that this will change. What happened in Jerusalem is likely to happen in many parts of the country. In the 6, 8, or 10 months in the campaign, there will certainly be great change in the composition of the population in the country. And then another quote, in his notes, he wrote, in May 1948, he had given orders for the destruction of Arab islands in Jewish population areas. This was connected to Plan Dalet. These quotes are numerous. This is just Ben Gurion, but you could find these amongst all the Zionist leaders. And this is why I call it ethnic cleansing.
Okay. And I think so, and I think this is really the crux of it. And I
was going to build on, I just wanted to, yeah. So you could see numerous quotes like this from all the Zionist leaders talking about population transfer. There was a very strong ideology of population transfer. And when we ask ourselves why, well, a Jewish state would need a Jewish demographic majority, a large demographic majority. That's if it were to be exclusive like we wanted it to be. Not a binational state, which we rejected, but an exclusively Jewish state. Come 1947 partition, we were given 55% of the land. The Palestinian population in the land we were given was 40%. You cannot have a Jewish state if it's 40% Palestinian. It's just not possible. Violence broke out. Then we see that not only did Ben Gurion, and I want to read this quote by Benny Morris because I think it's very, very important. And Benny Morris is a Zionist Israeli, and I think he's one of the most trustworthy sources on the Nakba, on 48. He goes, from April 1948, Ben Gurion is projecting a message of transfer. There's no explicit orders of it in his writing. There is no orderly, comprehensive policy, but there's an atmosphere of transfer. The transfer idea is in the air. The entire leadership understands that this is the idea. The officer corps understands what is required of them. Under Ben Gurion, a consensus of transfer is created. Ben Gurion played a large role in the ideology of transfer. We then see certain methods of intimidation that happened, or just straight up orders of expulsion, intimidation and psychological warfare in the forms of lighting streets on fire, shelling and mortaring buildings and cultural centers, radio broadcasts on radios and loudspeakers telling people to leave, and spreading rumors of massacres. When you look at all this and you look at the end result of 50% of Palestinians being expelled, that constitutes ethnic cleansing. I mean, it seems like we need to do great mental gymnastics for it to not be ethnic cleansing. And even if we were to do that mental gymnastics, it's not going to be an argument that convinces anybody but those who are already convinced.
Okay, so it's interesting that you bring Benny Morris, because Benny Morris says there wasn't ethnic cleansing. He says so if you're bringing him as the most reliable source, he categorically states there wasn't ethnic cleansing. He mentioned there were expulsions, but ethnic cleansing is a very strong language. And so I think one of the most important things we need to do here is, because there are quotes on all sides, you're dealing with the creation of an Arab state, the potential creation of an Arab state and a Jewish state. And the language of transfer was on both sides. So, for instance, the Prime Minister of Jordan One of the Hashims, I've forgotten his name. I've got it somewhere, I can pull it up. But he said there's no way that Arabs should be in the Jewish state. They should be an Arab state with Arabs and Jews in a Jewish state. It was, as you mentioned, it was the flavor of that generation and the generations prior, preceding and after and succeeding it. And so with Pakistan, the creation of Pakistan, you had 14 million Hindus and Muslims that switched sides, and I think was that 1 million people killed. You had with the ethnic Germans in Czechoslovakia and Poland, you had 10 million transfers. So this was very much the language. So of course, the leaders of the Zionist movement are going to be entertaining these ideas because it was seen as a moral solution to civilian and ethnic and religious conflicts at that time. But I think what's much more important to focus on than just the quotes is their actions as well. And one of the most telling signs, and I think it's Benny Morris that brings this actually, was there was only one instance where the question of should the Zionists expel, there were actually, let me step back, there were Lud and Ramla, which we can deal with separately, and the expulsions that took place there, because there were expulsions there. There were some of the villages that were used as operational bases for the Arab either militias or armies. There were also expulsions from those. But outside of those, when it came to the general Arab populations, the historical record isn't on your side. So the only instance we have of someone putting the question to Ben-Gurion was to do with Nazareth, as I'm aware. So in Nazareth, the commander of the 7th Brigade, actually a colonel of the 7th Brigade, was instructed by his commander to empty Nazareth, which was I think it was
Ramla and Lud where that.
No. So Ramla Lud will come back to. It's similar, but this is I think Ben Dunkelman, and he didn't want his troops to. He thought it was immoral to empty Nazareth. So the question was taken to Ben-Gurion, and so here you have the question: should Nazareth be expelled? And the question was put directly to. Should the Arabs of Nazareth be expelled? And the question was put directly to Ben-Gurion, and he said no. He said we should not expel the Arabs of Nazareth. Similarly, there are instances which I'm sure you're across, instances like Haifa. So there was the battle for Haifa. Before the battle, the Jewish mayor of the city, Shabtai Levi, begged the Arabs not to send their people away from the city. After the Arabs lost the conflict, Shabtai again, and this is recorded in both the British and Zionist archives, the Israeli and British archives, again begged the Arabs not to leave, and the Arab leadership of Haifa sent away the Arabs. There were definitely expulsions. Lud and Ramla being the prime examples, where I think it was around 50,000 Arabs were expelled, but that was after. There was fierce fighting from them. A peace treaty was agreed. The leader of I can't remember whether it was Lud or Ramla was killed. Violence erupted again, and those cities those towns were emptied. And so I completely agree that there were instances, but this wasn't a policy. It wasn't a mainstream. This wasn't the thrust of what the Zionist objective or actions were. And how do we know that? Well, if we look at what happened, Israel, when it was created, when all the dust settled, had 20% of its population were Arabs. And there's 20% of Israelis to this day remain Arabs. In contrast, on the other side, where you had the Arab leaders who were talking language of genocide, Egypt emptied Gaza of every last Jew. The Jordanians and the Arabs emptied the West Bank of Judean Samaria of every last Jew, or the British before them. But you effectively had the Jews were ethnically cleansed, and there were laws enacted which are still in place to this day. Article 6 of the Palestinian National Charter denies Jews the right to citizenship in a future Palestinian state. And so on one side, you did have clear ethnic cleansing because there wasn't one Jew left. On the other side, on the Israeli side, there are numerous instances of where there could have been ethnic cleansing. The option was available and it was rejected in favor of coexistence.
So, first of all, about Benny Morris, you're 100% correct that he does not consider it ethnic cleansing. I view Benny Morris as one of the most accurate historians in the research he's done and his reporting of what happened. When it comes to him calling it ethnic cleansing, it's not him reporting events, it's him interpreting what those events mean. But when you read the writing of Benny Morris, what he's describing very clearly is ethnic cleansing. The way he gets around it, and again, I view this as mental gymnastics, or just using a very narrow definition of ethnic cleansing. He says, because there was no master plan, no explicit orders from above, therefore it's not ethnic cleansing. But if we look at many other instances of ethnic cleansing, we don't find these explicit orders from above. Jews getting expelled from North African and Middle Eastern countries during 48 also were not a result of explicit orders from above. But yet Jews have no problem considering that to be ethnic cleansing. A lot of those expulsions were just done by neighbors turning on their Jewish citizens because they were upset about what was happening in Israel. So in addition to that, because there are some cities that were left, and again, I'm not making the claim that there was a master plan. I think that there was a strong ideology of ethnic cleansing, and we knew that there was a necessity to have a large demographic majority. So it's possible it was left to the discretion of the battalion commander, and a very large amount of battalion commanders decided to expel the entire neighborhood. You don't need to expel an entire population for it to be considered ethnic cleansing. Even if you clear one neighborhood of all its people, man, woman, and child, and destroy evidence of people living their homes, cultural centers, mosques, and don't let them return, that in itself constitutes as ethnic cleansing. So we could talk about Hamas having a policy of ethnic cleansing, but that doesn't mean that we ourselves didn't do it. And just doing it partially, again, doesn't mean it didn't happen. Just an interesting example, Holocaust deniers, one of the claims that they make to say that there was no Holocaust, they say there's no explicit orders from Hitler to kill the Jews. There's no written orders. He never said it himself. But we know through collecting enough evidence that he knew about it and he was involved in the process, right? So just because there's no explicit orders doesn't mean it doesn't constitute as genocide or ethnic cleansing. My claim for Palestinians is I don't think we committed genocide. We did not genocide the Palestinians. I think that's a false claim. But there's a very strong claim that we ethnically cleansed them. And the only way to get around that claim is to really use a version of the definition that is very narrow and, again, not going to convince people who aren't already convinced.
Okay, so I'd have to go back to how to explain the comments that were coming from the Arab leadership during and following when they themselves are saying that they encouraged the Arabs, the Palestinians, to leave. They created mass violence. So as an example, Mahmoud Abbas.
Just real quick, just so I understand the claim, are you talking about the claim, and this is a common false claim that many pro-Israel people make, that we didn't expel anybody, but they left because Arab leaders told them to leave?
I didn't say that we didn't expel anybody. I said this was a conflict and there was mass flight and there was encouraged mass flight. Both Benny Morris will admit this in his writings. He focuses more on the women and children who were encouraged to leave. But I'll just read a few quotes. I think quotes are important, particularly when they're coming from the leaders of that period. So Mahmoud Abbas in 76. So this is what he said: the Arab armies entered Palestine to protect the Palestinians from Zionist tyranny, but instead they abandoned them, forced them to emigrate and to leave their homeland. Forced them. So not just encouraged.
Who's this quote from?
Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas in 76. And and threw them into prisons similar to the ghettos in which the Jews used to live. Khaled al-Azm, who was then the Syrian prime minister, since 1948, we have been demanding the return of refugees to their home, but we ourselves are the ones who encourage them to leave. Only a few months separated our call to them to leave and our appeal to the United Nations to resolve their return. Nouri Said, the Iraqi prime minister, said, "We will smash the country with our guns and obliterate every place the Jews seek shelter. The Arabs should conduct their wives and children to safe areas until the fighting has died down." I can read many more quotes. You get the idea that during the conflict, people like Nouri Said were encouraging the Arab, the ALA and various other Palestinian and Arab forces were encouraging the women and children to go away. This is a conflict zone. And Benny Morris says this was one of their biggest mistakes, because once you send away the women and children, you have no reason to stand and fight and defend the village. If the village falls, you move on to the next place. And this, because you're not protecting them, you've got no reason to stay in a war zone. So that's one of Benny Morris's angles. But when you look at the general, as I mentioned, Haifa is a great example of where the Arab Higher Committee instructed the Arabs of Haifa that they had to leave or face serious repercussions from the Arabs. And so the Arabs fled while the Jews pleaded with them to stay, while the British said the British described them as foolish for leaving. And they told the Arabs they would regret leaving Haifa. And so I don't know how we both agree there were expulsions. We both agree that's something we agree with. We can get into was that moral or immoral? And we even get into what should happen to those that were expelled. So I think we maybe have a lot of common ground when it comes to what happens to the families who left, who were expelled from Lud and Ramla. I think that's what happens to either them or their descendants in terms of any future peace process is very different to what should happen to a family that fled from Haifa. Because one was willing, one was unwilling. I think there's nuance. Maybe there's a just solution for both people, but we do have common ground. There is common ground in that we both agree there are expulsions, but your language of ethnic cleansing doesn't marry up to what happened, because as I cited at the beginning, there is a large 20% of Israel's population in 1948, well, 1949 was Arab. 20% of Israel's population to this day is Arab. So, and when you couple that with all the documented evidence, there is no documented evidence, as we agree, of expulsion. And we have the Arab leadership at that time encouraging flight and admitting afterwards that they were responsible for that flight. And it's complete. I'm sure we can agree in a conflict, any conflict, there are civilian refugees. Civilians flee war zones. It's a very normal reaction to a war erupting. And to just blanket all of that as a campaign of ethnic cleansing, I think does a huge injustice to the Zionist cause and actually poses real moral questions on any Israeli who buys into that narrative that remains in Israel today. And I would include you in that. If you believe that Israel was born in sin and the land was taken from a population who were ethnically cleansed, there's some serious moral questions on what are you doing sitting in Galilee when you believe that this land was forcefully taken. So yeah, I've spoken for a lot and I've been a little bit personal, so apologies.
No, all good. No offense taken whatsoever. About the claim that most left on Arab orders, this has really been widely debunked by most historians, including Benny Morris. There's actually, it seems that there's more evidence of Arab leaders asking populations to stay than to leave. Let me just read one quote, okay, about on that, and then I want to get to some other information from Benny Morris and even from that the IDF put out. So this is a quote actually from Benny Morris. He goes, this is in his book, The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Crisis. In Kfar Saba, The locals, under threat from Haganah attack, wanted to leave, but they were ordered to stay by the Arab Liberation Army garrison. According to Haganah sources, the ALA, Arab Liberation Army, with the population of Ramallah about to take flight, blocked all roads into the triangle. The Arab military leaders are trying to stem the flood of refugees and taking stern and ruthless measurements against them. Arab radio broadcasts picked up by the Haganah conveyed orders from the ALA to all Arabs who had left their homes to return within 3 days. The commander of Ramallah assembled the Mukhtars, which are the official leaders from the area, and demanded they strengthen morale in their villages. The local ALA commanders turned back trucks, which were coming to take families out of Ramallah. Haganah intelligence on May 6th reported that Radio Jerusalem, in its Arabic broadcast, and Damascus Radio announced in the name of the Supreme Headquarters, every Arab must defend his home and property. Those leave their place will be punished and their homes will be destroyed. The announcement was signed by Fawzi I can't pronounce that last name. I don't know who he is either. So this is just one report of radio stations and actually the Arab Liberation Army telling people to stay in their homes. In addition to that, I want to read you actually a document put out by that was written by the IDF in 48. A document produced by the Israeli Defense Forces Intelligence Service entitled "The Emigration of the Arabs of Palestine in periods between January 1st, 1947 and May 1st, 1948. This was a document dated from June 1948. It became widely available in the 80s when a lot of the documents were declassified. They document 11 factors which caused the exodus and list them in the order of importance. Number 1, direct hostile Jewish operations against Arab settlements. Number 2, the effect of our Haganah IDF hostile operations against nearby Arab settlements, especially the fall of large neighboring centers. Number 3, operation of Jewish dissidents, Irgun and Leumi Chirut Israel. Number 4, orders and decrees by Arab institutions and gangs. So they do mention that. 4, orders and decrees, oh no, I read that. 5, Jewish whispering operations, psychological warfare aimed at frightening away Arab inhabitants. Number 6, ultimate expulsion orders. And again, this is some people who have a very narrow definition of ethnic cleansing are saying 6 is the only if it's ultimate expulsion orders. If it's truly explicit, then it's ethnic cleansing. Everything else doesn't count. But most people, most international lawyers, most historians do not have such a narrow definition of ethnic cleansing. They would consider 1, 2, 3, 5, and let's go to 7, fear of Jewish retaliatory response, major Arab attacks. 8, the appearance of gangs and non-local fighters in the vicinity of the village. 9, fear of Arab invasion and its consequences. So again, that plays into what you said. 10, isolated Arab villages in predominantly Jewish areas, and various local factors and general fear of the future. So most of these are not connected. Only two of the 11 are connected to Arab orders or things Arabs done, and most of them are signs of ethnic cleansing quite clearly.
So, and I think this is literally, I listened to that list. I was like, yeah, no, that's exactly what I'm saying. It's not ethnic cleansing. So, and you're listening to that list.
No. But
you're saying it is ethnic cleansing, and that's the problem.
But the main ones are not. So the fact that it's a result of Arab leaders, that was not the primary factor. The IDF admitted it. Benny Morris says there's not much evidence that there was orders from Arab leaders to leave. He thinks it makes up around 5% of those who left from explicit orders from the Arabs. Benny Morris goes on. He makes an assessment. He goes, what caused abandonment? Military assault on a settlement, 215 occurrences. Influence of a nearby town's fall, 59 occurrences. Expulsion by Jewish forces, 43 occurrences. Fear of being caught up in fighting, 48 occurrences. Whispering campaigns, which is a form of psychological warfare, 15 instances. Abandonment on Arab orders, 6 instances, and unknown, 44 instances.
So I think just to come back to each of those, I think it's really important. This is a civilian on civilian conflict, yeah? And so,
Well,
what it was. I mean, that's how Benny Morris describes it. It's how everyone describes the conflict. It was civilian, a
sure,
Jewish
we were an army of civilians.
and an Arab.
Yeah, okay.
It was militias. We weren't a nation at that point. The only nations were the Arab nations that invaded. So this was a conflict which involved civilians, and it was fought in towns and villages and cities, in urban centers and suburban and rural centers. And what you have, what the IDF are describing, and what Benny Morris is describing, is when you have a conflict in a village, in a town, you are going to have flight from that. That's not saying the intention of those troops that were going into that village was to expel the civilian population. It's saying there was a conflict, and as a consequence, there was flight. And I completely agree with that. I think everybody agrees with that. No one did. Very few people deny the flight of the Arabs. And the only instance you could say where it's ethnic cleansing, for me, which is what you were saying, that thin slices, where there were actual expulsions, where the IDF came in, when the Haganah, the Irgun, whoever it was, came in and actually physically forced out the inhabitants of that place. That would be a clear-cut case of ethnic cleansing. And in every other conflict, that's a clear-cut case of ethnic cleansing. Either you forcefully remove a population, and that is ethnic cleansing. You are cleansing them from your land because of their ethnicity. It's something that you have to you actively do. If you're going in and you're fighting a war and civilians flee, that's not ethnic cleansing. That happens in almost every conflict in the world. Like there were very few. The Syria was emptied recently. Every major conflict has flight. You can't label that ethnic cleansing. Otherwise, literally every conflict which involves religious or ethnic groups would be described that way.
Well, there's just a few major differences between other instances and what happened here. So first of all, as we said, there was a strong ideology of ethnic cleansing.
Sorry.
Fine. Hold on. A strong ideology of population transfer. Okay. We'll use that language. Plan Dalet, which was implemented, I believe it was in April. Hold on, in March of 1948, it was approved. That allowed for expulsion as a result of hostilities. So that essentially said, the Yishuv forces can go to towns. If there's any resistance, you are allowed to expel them. And as we said, Ben-Gurion made it known that it's perfectly okay. He gave, as they say, the wink and the nod that expulsion's okay.
You can't say that. You can't say he gave the wink and the nod. When the document instances, he said no. When it came to Nazareth, he said no.
But that's one example. Plan Dalet allows for expulsion if there's hostilities.
This is conspiracy theory. You got no evidence. All the evidence is there were Arabs that remained.
Wait, what do you mean? Plan Dalet is
operation. So Plan Dalet wasn't conspiracy. It was there, but the language of it isn't as you described. Like, it's literally the objective. I'm going to read the intro. The objective of this plan is to gain control of the areas of the Hebrew state and defend its borders. It's also aimed at gaining control of the areas of Jewish settlement and concentration which are located outside the borders of the Hebrew state, against regular, semi-regular, and small forces operating from bases outside or inside the state. Now, if we jump to 3.3, the F, but the clause F in Article 3, it says occupation and control of the front-line enemy position, which is what you're talking about. Generally, the aim of this plan is not an operation of occupation outside the borders of the Hebrew state. However, concerning enemy bases lying directly close to the borders, which may have been used as springboards for infiltration into the territory of the state, these must be temporarily occupied and searched for hostiles according to the above guidelines, and they must then be incorporated into our defensive systems until operations cease. It's talking about a temporary. They could expel the inhabitants of a village that was
temporary,
waging aggression. This is a civilian war. So when civilians from one village were attacking the not yet Israel Zionist state, when they were attacking the Jews, in those instances, you could, the IDF said, those instances you could temporarily empty that village.
Correct. And what we did is we emptied those villages, and then later on decided that we're not going to let them return. So
I agree. I agree. We decided.
But Plan Dalit allows you to expel full neighborhoods as a result of hostilities. That's ethnic cleansing.
But then when you go back to your IDF document, how many instances of that were there? Very few.
No,
I mean, that's from the document that you just read. It was way down. I can't remember. It was.
No. You're talking about abandonment. Hold on. Expulsion by Jewish. No, you're talking about expulsion by Jewish forces. But
yeah,
right. But that's not the only way to clear a city. So if you're assaulting a city, and we would use mortars on buildings, even civilian buildings. We had a lot of intimidation tactics to get people to leave. It wasn't always explicit orders. So to say that if you could clear out a village by surrounding it and starting to mortar it, and then everybody leaves as a result of that, no shit, they're going to leave. And then you don't let them return. You don't let them reclaim their property. You revoke their citizenship. All these, define ethnic cleansing. It's not as simple as there was a war and people left. We intimidated people to leave. They leave. We didn't let them come back, and we took their property. Now, I just want to answer. You said, if we were really born in sin, what am I doing here? Because I think this is important, and I think it'll let us move forward into what I consider to be a more important conversation. A country born in sin does not mean the country doesn't have a right to exist. What I view to be a more legitimate argument is that we ethnically cleansed the Palestinians, but given the circumstance, it was in our best interest. I don't expect people to then say, okay, fine, I support Israel, but I view that as a more honest claim. Just because a country is born in sin doesn't mean that country cannot, in time, be a force for good. I think Israel has had a great contribution to the world. I don't think it's had a great contribution to Palestinians, but I think we've had a great contribution to the world. And I very strongly believe that you do not create a justice by creating a new injustice. So all the Jews living here today, every single one of us, we were not involved in the creation of the country. We are not guilty for the creation of the country, nor should we be punished for it. So the whole idea, people saying Israel was born in sin, therefore Israel should be dismantled, I say, absolutely not. You do not punish a population for the errors of their grandparents. And just in trying to dismantle Israel, you are only further radicalizing the Israeli people, which ultimately harms the Palestinian people. What I suggest we do is acknowledge, regardless, and let's even say, I think it's clearly ethnic cleansing. I don't think I'm going to convince all Israelis of this, but I think there's a stronger case to be made that regardless of if you want to call it result of war, population transfer, ethnic cleansing, we need to understand the Nakba as a very important part of Palestinian grievances. And we should recognize our role in the Nakba. And without doing so, it's going to be nearly impossible to reconcile with the Palestinians. So we need to be firm in acknowledging that Israel has a right to exist. But we should also be firm in acknowledging the grievance of the Palestinians and the role our grandparents played in it. These two things can coexist peacefully.
Okay. And so I do want to pull it back slightly just to why, because I think it's a really important point. We can't just skip over it. Sure. And that is the fighting. And you described how in this conflict between civilian militias, the Israeli forces would shell a Palestinian village, potentially a civilian, and building would get hit. But the theme that seems to be coming, or the theme I'm sensing from you, is you could only be satisfied if Israel were not to respond. So if Israel is engaged in a civilian conflict in a village, and you have an Arab militia firing at the Jewish position, and you're saying that if the Jews fire back, that will lead to flight, and therefore that is ethnic cleansing. Therefore, the Jews shouldn't respond to that, either mortar fire, rifle fire, whatever's coming from the village. you're effectively saying that the Jews have no means, no moral means to defend themselves. If they respond and trigger flight from the Arab side, then they are guilty of ethnic cleansing, and that's nobody's definition of ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing is you cleanse an ethnicity because from the land because you don't want to live with them, and that is not the case. And what happens with Israel?
That's a very simplistic definition, though.
It may be a simplistic definition, but it's the definition I'm familiar with. In every instance of ethnic cleansing, is there is an intentional removal of an ethnic group from that region, an intentional, for whatever reasons, whether you're talking in Serbia or wherever it may be, where ethnic cleansing takes place, it's intentional. And there is an active force going in and removing another people. We're not talking about the flight of a people because there's a conflict. And so to bring it back, is like effectively this conflict is one party is acting defensively and another party is acting aggressively. So the aggression in 47, what triggered the civil war was 2 buses were shot at by Arab forces near Tel Aviv. What triggered the 48 war was Arab armies invaded Israel after it declared independence. And so in each instant, in the entire framing of this, it doesn't matter at what point you want to start, whether you want to start with the Nabi Musa riots in the 20s, all of the aggression was initiated by the Arabs and not by the Zionists. First and foremost, in the beginning, the Zionists weren't capable of what it would have been suicidal for them to wage conflict against the Arabs, who were far more numerous than the Zionists back in the 20s. And towards by 48, 47, both acts of aggression were initiated by the Arab side. And in that conflict, which you describe as a Nakba, as a catastrophe, you effectively have people that are fighting for survival versus people who are fighting for annihilation. I mean, this is the language that their leaders used. They used language of annihilation, extermination, and or on the softer side, driving the Jews into the sea. And I know Benny Morris disagrees that line was as frequently used as the Zionist camp claims, but it was certainly used. I mean, as in Pasha, it was one of the people who used that terminology, and so a phraseology. And so I'd like to bring it back to, which is effectively my position, is that in each instance, Israel or the Jews were acting defensively. There was mass flight. There were instances of expulsion. We have complete agreement. Benny Morris, you, myself, we all agree there were instances. But what's fascinating for me is you seem to be saying that this flight didn't take place. There wasn't flight of Arabs, and it would be the only conflict in literally the history of conflicts where civilians didn't flee war zones. Like you say, you seem to be saying that it was
there most certainly were flight of Arabs, and we used psychological warfare to increase the amount of Arabs that left their homes. Which also, if you look at the definition of ethnic cleansing, it explains that it doesn't need to be. It could be by means of intimidation as well. So yeah, I don't think it was knocking door to door and saying everybody needs to leave. I think we had many ways of expelling neighborhoods, and often it was used by psychological warfare. And there's many instances of the psychological warfare we used. But it's not just it's not just people fleeing war. It's people fleeing war, having their homes destroyed, their property confiscated, their citizenship revoked, and never being allowed to return home. It's not as simple as saying they just left as a result of war. We could not have had a Jewish state with the amount of Palestinians living on the land. We had to do something about it. How could you have a Jewish state with 40% Palestinian population? It just so happened to be they didn't support the partition. It's not hard to understand why. We wouldn't have accepted it if the roles were reversed. Their response to us was violent, as we responded violently to people who tried to conquer us in the past. Our excuse is, okay, you were violent. Now we're going to do what we need to do to expel people from their homes, and we're never going to let them return. It's not for no reason that most people, most historians, most scholars consider it ethnic cleansing, because there's such a strong case. And I really think this is why Israel, one of the reasons why Israel loses the PR war, because we make a lot of like very flimsy semantic arguments. They come off as mental gymnastics that makes it seem like overly apologetic and without an ability to acknowledge wrongdoing. And most people who actually look at the series of events reach very different conclusions. What that causes is they no longer take our words seriously. So somebody who is always defending Israel and will never criticize Israel, they don't have any legitimacy in their defense. They're not seen as objective. They're not seen as objective sources on the issue. What that does is allows for people who are critical of Israel to dominate the conversation when it comes to critique. So I could use myself as an example. I have many Palestinian people, follow my channel, and I know you do also have a fairly large Muslim following. But because people see me as someone who's capable of criticizing Israel, when I say that Israel has a right to exist, and in saying Israel shouldn't exist, you're only harming yourselves, they take that seriously. But if I were to just always defend Israel, never acknowledge any wrongdoing, make no effort to understand their narrative, me saying Israel has a right to exist is meaningless. It's only convincing those who are already convinced. So I really think not only is this the just approach to take, but it's also a way more effective approach to take.
Okay, and I think this is where we fundamentally disagree. If you think we win the PR war by claiming that we ethnically cleansed Arabs in a defensive war, where all of our leaders consistently said that every Arab that lives in the Jewish state will have equal rights under the law, which they do to this day. If your way of advocating and doing public PR for the state of Israel is to say that we ethnically cleansed, I don't know how many people you believe, 500,000 to 1 million people, I think that's a suicidal strategy. When your argument is, I mean, there is so much opposition. You know that within the Zionist camp, your position is certainly the minority camp. And you're right, internationally, there are more people believe that Israel is responsible for ethnic cleansing than within the Zionist camp. Within the Zionist camp, the overwhelming majority of people do not believe that. They have a very different narrative to you. And I think it's a very bizarre strategy to take, to go out and say, yes, we are responsible for ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, when there's no documented evidence of this in terms of orders given, which you say, okay, well, we're fine. If we don't count, if orders aren't important, let's look at what happened.
Plan Dalet was orders given
temporarily. It says temporarily in it, and it says it's a defensive strategy. It's a defensive strategy.
For sure, it was temporarily, and then we changed our minds and made it permanent.
So again, that you won't hear argument from me to say that once the Arabs fled, they weren't allowed back. I don't think anybody, or very few people, you'd have to be an idiot in the Zionist camp to say that wasn't what happened. That is what happened. That is why the Arabs did stay. But that was always because there is the anticipation, the expectation, or there certainly was historically, that an Arab state would be created. And the majority of Palestinian refugees didn't flee to Lebanon. They didn't flee to Jordan. They fled it was Jordan because they annexed it, but they fled to the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, or to Gaza. So you literally had the Jews were forced from the Arab side into the Jewish state, and the Arabs weren't forced, certainly from my narrative, my perspective, from the history I've read, fled to the Arab side. And so you would expect any Arab state that was to emerge there, which was exactly what happened with Jordan. Jordan gave all of those refugees, or those that fled, they gave them citizenship. And you had effectively the population transfer that we saw in Eastern Europe, that we saw in India and Pakistan. And so, yeah, of course, they're not going to say, yes, you can now come back. There was the expectation that this was going to resolve the situation. You would have an Arab state, be it Jordan, Egypt, whatever, and a Jewish state. And all of those Arabs that remained in Israel that weren't hostile, they were given citizenship. They have complete equality under the law to this day. And the words of Ben Gurion, of Chaim Weizmann, of all of the early Zionist leaders are true to this day. And so then, just to bring it back, we did then touch on your personal situation. I genuinely cannot understand how someone who is as considerate as you, who's so thoughtful and clearly interested in pursuing what you would believe to be a moral path, I can't understand how you would move from one land where there's definitely also got its historical injustices in terms of America, and then move to a land that you believe was effectively stolen, and the indigenous, I'm sure you think they were indigenous, the indigenous people were ethnically cleansed from that land. I can't understand how you could make that transition if that's what I can't believe how can you sleep in somebody else's bed if you believe with all sincerity that bed was taken from someone.
It probably has something to do with the fact that I grew up on land whose natives were genocided, that I was kind of used to living on stolen land. So what's the difference? That's me just being snarky, but I grew up in the U.S. The U.S. has a far harsher history than Israel ever could have. So I don't really see that as a reason not to move here. But when I moved here, I didn't have nearly as deep of an understanding. I was your just typical Zionist. I came here to defend my people, and I still think we're a people who need defending. I just understood that our version of history and our narrative is just a part of the narrative, and there's a whole other side that needs to be explored.
So on that, we agree. Yeah. I think the other side should be explored and listened to.
When it comes to, again, we're going back and forth about like leaders, what they said, the series of events. We could keep doing this back and forth. I have a feeling we've each shared our perspectives. I don't know if we're going to make any more progress when it comes to, was it forced expulsion? Was it ethnic cleansing? I think hopefully the audience can make a judgment for themselves. I personally would like to have our conversation now evolve into more productive means, because I ultimately firmly believe it was ethnic cleansing. It's not for no reason most historians and scholars agree. Again, you could disagree, but I think there's something more important, and that's how do we move forward. Now, when it comes to strategy, this is not, I can't claim it's causation, it might just be correlation, but Israel advocacy, not the Israel advocacy movement, not you, but Israel advocacy in general is not effective. We're losing. We're losing badly. And it's possible we'd be losing badly regardless, but I think we're losing badly because the vast majority of the arguments that Israel advocates make are constructed in such a way that they are only going to convince people who are pro-Israel. They're not the kind of arguments that convince Palestinians. They're not the kind of arguments that can convince anybody who sympathizes with the Palestinians. And there's no reason why somebody shouldn't sympathize with the Palestinians. They're human beings after all. So, and this it self-reinforces, because when you see that you're getting a lot of likes and comments and praise, and you have a huge, I'm not talking about you specifically. I don't want to, make a claim about your motives or intentions, but in general, Hasbara pages, when they see that they're getting positive reinforcement from pro-Israel people, they could have millions of followers. It seems like they're doing great. They're not measuring the impact they're having. No one, like very few are actually saying, how many minds did I change? They're saying, how big can I grow my channel? That's not the right approach. If we want to be effective, we need to stop thinking, how can we have the biggest possible channel? The question is, how can we have the biggest possible impact? And the vast majority of the arguments that the pro-Israel side makes are constructed in such a way that they're just going to appeal to those who are already agreeing with them. Let me give you just one quick example. For example, the main, I don't want to get deep into Sheikh Jarrah, it's just a whole nother thing, but the excuse for Sheikh Jarrah is, it's just a legal dispute, right? How's that going to convince people who think that the law in Israel isn't equal for for Jews and Palestinians, right? So you say, hey, but it's just a legal dispute. It's nothing like malicious, but people don't view the law as equal. That's just one example of a very common narrative pro-Israel people make that's not going to convince anybody who's not already convinced. So my approach to advocacy, and again, it's not that my only goal is to make Israel look good. It's to actually solve the conflict. So I recognize we need to recognize Palestinian grievances, and I also understand and witness that the more honest we could be in our criticism of ourselves, A, it helps us improve ourselves, but B, it gives us legitimacy in our defense. So I don't think us being honest about ethnic cleansing weakens us. I actually think it makes our defense more trustworthy.
Okay, so I think it's the crux of it. We have a fundamentally different strategy to making peace. One of the things I encountered when I got into this space was most of those that were involved in peace take your strategy, and that is to go in and say, I support Israel, but, and there's always a but. There's always something they feel they have to criticize about Israel. On the other side, the narrative is simple. You still stole my land and you kill children. So while those involved in progressive Hasbara, the progressive PR, progressive peacemaking, their strategy is always one of weakness. It's one of going in and saying, I am sorry for everything that my people have done. I share your perspective. I listen to your narrative and I agree. And here's a little thing about my narrative. And I'll give you some real world examples. I debate with people who've gone off and fought in Syria for Daesh. I debate with neo-Nazis. I debate with all manner of people. There's one individual who was responsible for the Sharia patrols in London a few years ago when non-Muslims were being confronted for not acting according to the Sharia in East London. He was connected to the London Bridge terror cell. He's done time for numerous extremist Islamist examples. I debate him, and every time I've debated him, I've come from an unapologetic stance. And I was recently reading in the comments, or not recently, a few years ago now, the comments under a debate I had with another dawah caller, another Muslim preacher called Muhammad Hijab. And under it, he wrote, Joseph has more al-walabara than the Muslims. He loves his people, and how can we expect anything else from him? So he continued, but he effectively was saying, here you have someone who loves Israel, who loves the Jewish people. He isn't degrading them. He isn't belittling them. He's actually putting forward their position without compromising. And so take Sheikh Jarrah. You're right. If somebody believes that Jews are ethnically cleansing the Arabs from Sheikh Jarrah, and you say it's just a matter of them not paying rent, it's a real estate dispute, that's not going to convince anyone. But if you then point out to them, this is a 50-year legal battle, it's been waging in the courts for decades now, that's suddenly, actually, maybe there is more nuance. Maybe if Israel just wanted to ethnically cleanse the Arabs from Sheikh Jarrah, they could do that tomorrow. But the fact that's been fought through the Israeli courts for 50 years, and there have been numerous potential solutions put on the table that for whatever reason hasn't worked, it shows that maybe the nuance isn't that Israel's trying to ethnically cleanse Arabs from Sheikh Jarrah, but maybe, just maybe, there is actually a dispute because of the complexity of what's going on there. The fact that it was once a Jewish neighborhood, and then it became Arab homes were built on top of it by Jordan and by the United Nations Relief Work Agency. Maybe, just maybe, there is more complexity than it's simply Israel is trying to ethnically cleanse Arabs. And so I believe the only way you will create peace between Muslims and Jews, between Zionists and anti-Zionists, is by coming from a position of confidence, by conviction that there is a moral There is a moral reason, because for you backing the existence of the Jewish state, because if your only reason for supporting the state of Israel is well it exists, so like the state of Israel exists and therefore I support it, is a very, very weak argument. That's not going to convince anybody who believes that you, living in the Galilee, are occupying someone else's house, and your argument, it's almost the meme of Jacob. If I didn't steal it, someone else would. That's literally the argument that you're putting forward. And I think that's a very, very weak argument. I don't think that's going to convince anyone. I think what will convince people is the actual realities, the nuance, the complexity. So Sheikh Jarrah being a great example. If someone believes that Jews are ethnically cleansing Arabs from Sheikh Jarrah, how do you explain decades of legal battles within the court? How do you explain the various different solutions that were put on the table and rejected? And so I don't think that the way to win hearts and minds for Israel is to say, yeah, you're right, we ethnically cleansed the land, but hey, I'm going to move from America there because America did an even bigger genocide. I don't think that's going to win anybody over.
So, I hear this claim that we need to come from a place of strength, but I actually view over defensiveness as a sign of weakness. I've never viewed that as strength. I mean, and again, we seem to have different standards for how we view a collective rather than an individual. But if you ever meet somebody and they get super defensive about any like criticism or anything they did wrong, you don't see that as like a proud and confident individual. You see that as somebody weak. I think we can be confident and strong in acknowledging a wrongdoing. So again, our past is difficult. We could explain the nuance of ethnic cleansing for sure. We could explain that we couldn't have had an exclusive Jewish state if we didn't transfer populations. But we also can firmly explain that in no instance in the world do past wrongdoings justify dismantling of sovereign nations. There's not a single country that they're calling for the dismantling of because of what they did in the past. You do not punish the offspring, the future generations of people who made mistakes. This is consistent across the board. If somebody says you ethnically cleanse Palestinians, therefore Israel should be dismantled, I'd say, why aren't you calling to dismantle the dozens of other countries that were born through conflict? You could question them on their hypocrisy. You could also say, do you really think that Israelis are going to give up on their security? When Israelis hear you calling for the dismantling of their nation, that just radicalizes them. It makes them empathize less with the Palestinians. It makes them support harsh policies towards the Palestinians. You saying that Israel should be dismantled is harming the Palestinian narrative. Yes, we made mistakes in the past, but that doesn't mean we can't change the present and the future. This is a strong argument that appeals to many people. It deals with the grievances of the Palestinians because you recognize the harm that has been caused them, but you also firmly stand your ground and say Israel is not going anywhere, and just trying to dismantle Israel is only harming the Palestinian cause.
Okay. So I think one of the key differences, and I don't think we're going to reconcile this, is you continuously go back to, well, you believe that this is ethnic cleanse, or it was.
Yeah, I'm happy for the sake of it to call it population transfer, regardless.
I'm not saying no. I didn't believe it was a population transfer. I believe there was flight. There was small number of cases of expulsions that were in complete Lod, Ramla, but there were numerous instances like Haifa, like Nazareth, where expulsions were avoided, and many cases the Jews begged the Arabs to stay. And you can keep saying that there was ethnic cleansing because there was less Arabs.
Wait, correction. There's a very few instances of Jews begging Arabs to stay. Not many, very few.
So there's Haifa. So we both agreed that in Haifa, the Jews begged the Arabs to stay and a large population was forced out. Yeah, that we can agree with. So we can say that Haifa, there wasn't ethnic cleansing. We can say Nazareth, there wasn't ethnic cleansing. We can say Jaffa, there wasn't ethnic cleansing. We can literally go to all of the major battles, with the exception of Lud and Ramla, and say that there wasn't ethnic of any of the large population centers. Where we have difference of opinion is the villages, Operation Dalit or Plan Dalit. That's where we disagree. And you believe there was an intentional act of ethnic cleansing on the part of the Zionists. Benny Morris, who you continuously quote, disagrees with you. I disagree with you. Most Zionist historians disagree with you. And most anti-Zionist historians, who are far more numerous, why you can continuously say the majority, most anti-Zionist historians agree with you. Yeah? So you are in the anti-Zionist camp.
Wait, I think that's a false dichotomy. I would say that the majority of historians don't approach this in terms of Zionism and anti-Zionism. A historian should try to approach it objectively and look at the events. So I don't think we could consider every historian as either in one camp or the other.
Really? So I agree in theory. We need to go through. Ilan Pappé. Can we agree that Ilan Pappé is an example? Is an activist? And
yeah,
so there's
Ilan Pappé, Norman Finkelstein, Rashid Khalidi. These are all anti-Zionist historians.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
and by the way, I actually don't. I have my disagreements with them as well. I'm not fully in line with them either. I just think that the term ethnic cleansing applies accurately here. I don't view it as picking a side. It's viewing a series of events, viewing intention, viewing the motive, viewing the process in which we engage in war, and viewing the outcome. And ethnic cleansing seems like a perfectly suitable word. I do acknowledge that it's inflammatory. I get that. It's uncomfortable. I'm even okay as like a transition process. I don't think that every Israeli needs to acknowledge that ethnic cleansing occurred. I think that Israelis need to acknowledge that what we tried to do on this land, it was inevitable that Palestinians would be harmed, and we need to understand our role in their suffering.
Can I ask a question then, a very personal one? Why did you choose to live in the Galilee as opposed to Ramallah or any Palestinian Authority population center in Judea and Samaria?
Because the quality of my life would be substantially better in the Galilee than in Ramallah.
So effectively, it's a colonizer argument then. You believe that there was ethnic cleansing. You believe the Jews came in and colonized the land. You're choosing to live in the higher quality of land area, which was taken from what you believe to be the indigenous people. I mean, you may think Jews are indigenous as well. And you're choosing to live...
I do think we're indigenous.
Yeah. And you're choosing to live under that side rather than the Arab side.
Look, deciding to live in a place where you're comfortable, I mean, that's not a colonizer argument. That's what humans across the board decide to do. First of all, I can't live in Ramallah. But even if I could...
Why? Why can't you live in Ramallah?
Jews aren't allowed in Area A.
And what about... No, not Jews. Jews are Israelis.
Israelis, and that's an Israeli law.
Yeah. So if you're coming from America, you could choose to go in the Palestinian Authority place, yeah?
Yeah, I think an American Jew, sure, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, technically, you actually can't. Article 6 denies you, but in theory, maybe you could. Maybe you could get away with it. But you chose to go to the colonizer's side, yeah? You chose to side with the colonizer.
For sure.
And so for me, that's the thing I find the most perplexing about all of this, because
but I've explained past wrongdoings again. So we are Zionism is an indigenous rights movement that used colonial methods to liberate themselves. Okay, so these two things are not contradictory. If I was around during the creation of Israel, there's a high probability I wouldn't have approved of what the Zionists were doing. That doesn't mean I can't live in Israel today. I wouldn't live in a settlement today because today I view what's going on and I think that our presence in the settlement is causing collective punishment to Palestinians. So I choose to live in Israel proper, where my existence here doesn't contribute to the suffering of another group of people. There's nothing wrong or inconsistent about that. I love Israel. My family lives in Israel. My family actually moved to Israel in 1812. I'm 10th generation, technically. So, people have a right to live where they're comfortable. We just need if you living someplace, if you living someplace is going to contribute to someone else's suffering, then yeah, you should probably ask yourself if that's the best place to live. But if you go to living in a place that's flawed, that's fine. Work to improve it. That's our patriotic duty to improve the countries we live in.
So I agree. I think we'll move off this point. For me, it seems incredibly hypocritical if you believe that there's 500,000 people, I don't know how many you believe, were displaced from the land that you're now living, and you believe that's an injustice, and those people are still alive today, and many of them are living in camps in places like Lebanon, and you are potentially occupying, I don't know where you're living, but potentially occupying land that they would have believed to be theirs.
Yeah, I'm living in Kfar Vradim, which is built on a Palestinian village that was destroyed in 1948.
And so great. And so you're literally living on the land, and the descendants of the people that were living there before you would maybe question whether you aren't inflicting harm if your narrative is correct. I don't believe your narrative is correct.
They could question that. Sure, they could question that. I mean, I think my contribution is to make things better is greater than contribution to more harm. Me living here or not isn't what's going to give Palestinians the right of return. But as an Israeli who actually cares about making things better, I think my presence in this space will ultimately be positive. So, I don't see me living here as net negative. I think, in fact, it's net positive. Obviously,
I agree. I think it's net positive, but I just don't buy that your forefathers ethnically cleansed the people from there. I believe there was a defensive war that we fought and we won. There was flight of many Palestinians during that war. A small number of expulsions during that war, but in no way constitutes, by my definition of ethnic cleansing. You have a different definition, and that's fine.
Yeah.
But for me, it's just and this is the irony of it. I'm sitting outside of Israel. I'm living in Britain, and I'm not an occupied land by your definition. There's many places in the world you could have gone to, but you chose to.
You're not living on occupied land, but you're benefiting from hundreds of years of extraction of resources from countries all over the world. Living in England, but you're not guilty for that. So continue to enjoy it. We should never feel guilty for the actions of other people. I don't feel guilty for the Nakba. It had nothing to do with me. I don't feel guilty for our military presence in the West Bank because it's not in my control. I feel as a proud Israeli that it's my duty to work to improve Israel, and so that's what I'm dedicated to doing. I love my country, and I'm going to dedicate my life not only to improving my country, but also to ensure that our existence on this land doesn't come at the expense of another population. I genuinely believe that we can live here in peace with our Palestinian neighbors. It doesn't need to be one or the other, and I'm going to dedicate. Well, I can't speak for my whole life, but for now, I'm dedicating all my free time to trying to make things better, not only for me, but for our neighbors who we happen to share a common ancestor with,
And what I would say, just before, there's a few questions from the audience. I would like to say, anybody who is interested in seeing how Adar does that, and I genuinely mean this, we have a huge disagreement on whether there was ethnic cleansing or whether Israel was born in sin. For me, Israel is the most moral, not the most, but it's a very incredibly strong example of how an oppressed people can liberate themselves, can overcome incredible odds, overcome incredible hostility, and not resort to barbarism in the face of potential annihilation. Of a nation that can grant minority communities complete equality, as the majority population, and I believe that was there from 48, and it's there to this day. So we have a fundamental difference of opinion on the history. But what I would say is we share the belief that Jews and Muslims can coexist in the land. We probably have radically different strategies as how to achieve that. But we share that same aim, and anybody who's interested in seeing how Adar does that, I would seriously encourage them to check out the Sulha. I wasn't lying when I said this is one of the few podcasts I religiously listen to. I'm trying to lose my lockdown belly at the moment with lots of cycling. Every bike ride I put on one of your podcasts. So anyone who wants to check out your work before we go to their questions, please, they can find you on YouTube.
Can we maybe even drop a link in the chat?
Definitely, yeah. I'm going to put it in both YouTube and on Facebook. I'm just going to pull up the link now for people and share that. But while I'm pulling up that link, I'll just drop in. I think we had 2 super chats. By the way, you get way more super chats than I do. I got a much larger audience, and you kill me on making that cash money. So all we can say is the pro-Palestinian crowd is definitely more generous with the donation.
Yeah, what's that about? Is the majority of my super chats from pro-Palestinian people? I don't know. I'm gonna need to think about that. Most of my patrons, though, are Israeli or Jewish, so that's interesting.
So the only question we have one comment, which is let me see if I can find the super chats. They're too far gone. Okay, one from, I'm really apologize, I can't pronounce your name. It looks like Oren Mir from Norway. Shalom from Norway. Shall a nation be born at once? Zion traveled and brought forth her children. So just a quote from the Bible. And then we've got Nir Ruff, who is saying, do you think, and this is, I believe to you, Adar, do you think that Israel needs to teach the Palestinian narrative in schools?
Yeah, I do. I think we need to understand the Palestinian narrative, and we need to speak Arabic. It's very hard to make peace with people who you don't understand and you can't communicate with. I don't think anybody's leaving this land. The Jews are here to stay. The Palestinians are here to stay. We need to work on reconciliation. That requires speaking a common language and knowing who we're speaking to, understanding their narrative and their grievances.
Yeah, and to be honest, I don't believe we should teach the Palestinian narrative in schools, but I believe Arabic should be taught. I believe that we should be exposed to the Palestinian narrative. I think there's a difference between being exposed to it and being taught it. Being taught suggests that it's more fact, or it gives it more legitimacy, but I certainly think we should be at least familiar with what they're saying. And I think Arabic is fundamental to understanding the conflict. Yeah. Otherwise, you do, as I do, rely on the interpretation of events from someone else. And that's never a great way to understand another culture, because it's being filtered for you. So
I actually agree with you, and I want to build on that. I don't think that there's aspects of the Palestinian narrative that just aren't factually true. I don't think that we should be learning things that aren't true as fact. I think we should be learning, we should understand what their narrative is, even the parts that aren't true. And then our understanding of the conflict should not be what it is now, but it should be one that gives more credence to what they're saying, because it's a very one-sided narrative now. So we should teach young people how to think critically and how to understand that things aren't as simple as good versus bad. I think that would be the best approach forward. And that would be taking a lot of things from our current narrative and a lot of things from the Palestinian narrative and combining it into one unified narrative. That's what I think we need to work to do.
Perfect. So we're going to open up to any questions from the chat. Adar, feel free to drop off whenever you want. We've already been going for an hour and a half.
Yeah, no, I could stick around. I mean, first, I just want to thank you again, because a lot of advocacy pages, again, they'd rather have these echo chambers. They want to, they don't like challenge. It's just easy to just preach to the choir and continue to get those likes and shares and positive reinforcement. That's not the path you're going down, so I commend you. As for real quick, I did see that there were a lot of personal attacks in the chat.
Sorry.
What I would say.
Sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
Yeah. What I would say is I urge you all to be able to engage with people on the merits of their ideas, have a vibrant disagreement, listen to what they're saying, challenge what they're saying without getting into personal attacks. Personal attack is generally a weakness. It generally shows that you can't argue on merit, so you engage in an ad hominem. I saw a fair amount of people call me a self-hating Jew. I'm most certainly not a self-hating Jew. It's true I don't have a deep connection to the Jewish religion. I am agnostic at the end of the day, but I very much feel connected to the Jewish people.
I've got one question, which these are that type of question I get all the time, so I'll answer this one. Adar, do you think that Joseph is a real Jewish?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I think he's definitely a real Jew. I think in terms of like Jewish, Jewish as the religion, like believing in the books, he's more Jewish than me. In terms of the people, we're equally Jewish.
Okay, we'll just rattle through some. And I also agree. I think the ad hominems don't add anything. I think you are a man who's devoted to peace, and you have a different path to I and most within the Zionist camp. I don't believe you should be excommunicated. You clearly support this existence of Israel in some form, and you're advocating for peace. And I think that's something that's commendable. We can have a difference of opinion and a different path to peace, but that doesn't mean that you should be accused of being a self-hater, etc. I don't think that is the case. I've listened to many of your conversations. I just think your history is a little faulty, but that's the beauty of something like this.
You know, I did see somebody say that they think I should leave the country and they'd be happy to buy my ticket to California. I mean, you could just support me on Patreon if you want to throw down money for my cause.
Or you could give it to a Zionist cause. You're a Zionist as well.
Sure. I saw the question you pulled up about the Czechoslovakia, German. Yeah. So I actually can't comment on that because I don't know that situation well enough. I'm not a history expert. The history I know best is the history of this land because that's the conflict I'm interested in. I would need to learn more about it to be able to make an assessment.
Okay, so let me just scrolling through to see if I can pick up some questions. Okay, here you go. Here's one. Why were Jews hated and attacked before 1948 in Arab Muslim countries?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, Jews have a very difficult history. In any country, they were a minority. If you look at it relative to Europe, actually, it was better to be a Jew in the Middle East for most of our history than it was in Europe. Europe was far worse for Jews than Muslim countries. There are a fair amount of list of pogroms and attacks against Jews. What the exact cause for anti-Semitism is, I mean, there's full books written on this. Some of the Muslim anti-Semitism comes from the Quran. Other parts of it were taken actually from Europe, like blood libel seems to be a European idea that made it over to the Middle East. I think in general, minority groups, it's not just the Jewish minority group that has had a difficult history. It's just we survived to tell stories of it. So I think a lot of it comes down to that. I think other minority groups that have dealt just didn't make it to share these stories. But I read it was what's his name? The British rabbi that recently passed away.
Rabbi Sachs.
Rabbi Sachs, yeah. So in his book, he explains a very interesting concept, not in God's name. He explains that often when people are fighting, when there's infighting in a society, they turn to the minority as a scapegoat. And he explains that there's even an evolutionary basis to this. It stopped tribes from killing each other. They found somebody else to blame. So that could also play into it, just infighting turned on Jews. And I've heard stories that a lot of times when anti-Semitism is worst, it is when people are fighting with one another. United States is an example of this right now. As there's a greater divide between the left and the right, between white people and black people, anti-Semitism is increasing. So again, some of it could come from the Quran, some of it could come from European ideas, some of it could come from infighting. I think there's a lot of things playing into it.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. I think there's a big religious factor to it. I think you tend to find anti-Semitism largely in nations that either are or were Christian or Muslim. So I think the religious dimension of anti-Semitism can't be separated. We do have one question for me, which I'll quickly just throw up. Question for Joseph. What is your personal definition of ethnic cleansing? You kept referring to it, but didn't say what it is. For me, it's very simple. It's the forced removal of an ethnic group by another ethnic group who have the intention of making an ethnically homogenous region. I think that would be how I define it, and I don't think that's what happened in the 48 war. I think it was a defensive war where we didn't actively go out to attack anybody. We fought defensively, and we fought urban and rural areas where we were being attacked from. If you didn't attack us, like Abu Ghosh, there's still an Arab population there to this day. So I don't think that falls under any definition of ethnic cleansing. But obviously, we've just done an hour and a half backwards and forwards, so we won't revisit that, because I think we've done it to that's
I see an interesting one. Why do you call yourself a Jew when you do not believe in the God of Israel? Because Judaism is not only a religion; it's also it's a meta-ethnicity. It's a people. So I'm of the Jewish people. You know, when I did a DNA test, it came out that I was 99.7% Ashkenazi. Some would like to say that would make me a Khazar, but other DNA tests show that makes me 50% European and 50% Levantine of this land. You know, so I'm a Jew regardless of what I believe.
And I believe in the God of Israel, and irrespective of what he believes, I also consider him a Jew. I think one of the things which is more interesting for that is why the need for a Jewish state, and ethnically, because if it's not religiously, it's ethnically Jewish, and that doesn't really align with most progressive sensitivities today. Like I say, it's most progressive movements outside of Israel would not be advocating for a state based along ethnic lines. I think that's a more interesting question of why you would choose to align yourself with either a movement or a nation that does. I understand you are Jewish, and that's maybe why, right. But it does kind of contradict most progressive streams of thought.
Yeah, so it's a good question, because I do acknowledge that I don't think there was any way to initially do Zionism that wouldn't have caused ultimately war and expulsion. I think just trying to have an exclusive Jewish state on a land that had other inhabitants, there's no reason to think why they would accept that. I think perhaps a binational state would have worked, but here we are 73 years later, and today I do not support a binational state, because today I don't think it would have worked. I think there's too much bad blood between us that if we decide tomorrow to have a binational state, we're just going to have demographic competition. We're going to work to outnumber each other, so one group can have political control over the other. So again, there's understanding things from the past that doesn't necessarily hold true. That it doesn't mean you use the same exact model today. Things change, your approach to situations change. So no, I think a binational state is what we should have gone for. Originally, we should have worked with the Palestinians to build a state together. Today, I think we could have a binational state after generations of living in peace with one another.
Cool. A few more questions. So Joseph and Adar separately, who do you each define as a Palestinian, whether they're inside or outside of Israel? My answer is really simple. Anyone that defines themselves as a Palestinian, that belongs to the community that lived in this region, I'm happy to call them Palestinian. Do I think those are Palestinian people pre-48? No. Pre-60s, very, very few people would identify as being Palestinian. I think it's a modern identity, but there is no shaking or getting away from the fact there are millions of people today that self-identify as Palestinian, and who am I to deny them their identity? So that would be for me. So if they're living in Israel or outside of Israel, it's to do with whether they self-define as Palestinian.
I agree. I don't have anything to add. I would say that it's true that before 48, not many identified as Palestinian, but the beginning of their national aspirations did begin in the 1800s. It didn't just begin in the 40s or in the 60s. There was signs of the local Arabs living here wanting independence in the 1800s. Once, and very much so, the Palestinian identity solidified as a response and result of Zionism. Often your identity strengthens when you're in conflict because of your identity. So, yeah.
I don't really. I could disagree on the little nickels, but it's not really worth it. I largely agree with what you said. Let's just jump through. Are there any more questions?
Well, what about this? Dan goes, Adar, how do you accept the Jews being ethnically cleansed from Israel before the Palestinians were there? I mean, I don't support that. I'm against that. Like, way too many people. I think we gotta, the school system needs to work on like teaching people better like arguments and critical thinking. Just because I'm critical of Israel doesn't mean I'm not critical of other places. Just because we've done wrong doesn't mean they haven't done wrong. Like the world is more complex to just simplify it into this black and white. Right now we're talking about Israel and Israel's past, so I'm focusing on Israel. Of course I'm against ethnic cleansing when it happened to Jews.
Okay, so we've got one for me, which is, Joseph, do you support a secular Israel? Easy answer, yes. I do not trust the rabbis we have today to run a religious state. I think it would be an absolute disaster. I believe in the separation of synagogue and state, and I think that's very healthy for everybody living in the land.
I agree with you on that. You see, there's a fair amount we agree on.
Okay, I tell you what, we've gone on now for an hour and 45 minutes. I'd like to wrap it up. I've dropped the link in the chat. I'm also going to drop the link in the description. Sorry, I forgot to put that in before. So I'll just drop in.
Okay, can we do one more, because I like this one?
Yeah,
Adar, have
please,
the Palestinian. Please. Okay, so Adar, have the Palestinian Arabs done any wrong? Yes, a whole lot, a whole lot. First of all, creating a culture of martyrdom, I think, is a big mistake. The strong culture of anti-normalization, saying you do not speak to Israelis, I think that's a huge mistake. I think way too much money has gone to funding and supporting terrorism and not building Palestinian infrastructure. I think the very difficult socioeconomic condition many Palestinians are in, some of it is attributed to Israel, but a lot of it is attributed to the PA and Hamas. I fully recognize why Palestinians didn't accept us in 48, but I think they should come to terms with the fact that Israel is here to stay, and the continued denial of acceptance of Israel's existence 73 years later, I think, is harmful to them, and they should change their approach. So yeah, I mean, we could go on for days. I'm very, and if you come to my channel, you'll see I criticize both sides. I am constantly getting hate mail and hate messages from Israelis and Palestinians. They both think I'm a radical, both think I hate the other side. So all good.
I think the only thing I'd add to that is one thing I think often gets overlooked. By most try to see this as a nationalist conflict between two nations vying for the land. And I don't think that is the case. I think this is, certainly from the Palestinian side, a religious conflict. It's a jihad. It's been a jihad from the beginning, from the inception. The language of the leaders of the Arab world was all about Islam. And I think the thing I would look to the Palestinians is that there will never be peace while this is seen through a religious context. It has to move to a secular context from the Palestinian side, and I don't imagine that's going to happen anytime soon. The conflict was initiated along religious lines, and to this day it continues along religious lines. Hamas are the metaphorical great grandchildren of Haji Amin al-Husseini. It's the same ideology that's driving both parties. And yes, there's always been moderates within the camp, and Husseini was seen even by the Arab League as an extremist, as a terrorist, as a hateful person. But nonetheless, that is something that in my opinion, Palestinians have got wrong from day one, is making this religious. It hasn't been religious from the Jewish side up until very recently. And I kind of agree with what you're saying. I think that is in reaction. The religious identity of the Jewish side is in reaction to the religious identity of the Palestinian side. I think it's a cause and effect. But yeah, the only thing I think that often gets overlooked in these conversations is people are afraid to say that this is actually religion has a big part to play in why it's such a mess on the ground.
I agree to an extent, but I think if all Palestinians were to become atheists tomorrow, the conflict wouldn't be solved.
I think it would be much easier to be solved, though.
Sure, yeah, no, I think if you take out any of the elements, it would be easier. So if you take out the nationalism, it would be much easier. If you take out the religion, it would be much easier. I think it's a combination of things, but I don't like, it's not just religion, right? It's religion, it's national, it's It's even cultural to an extent. It's people of different cultures not feeling comfortable living with each other.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. All right, and on that note, we've done an hour and 49 minutes. I always aim for an hour, and I never, ever, ever hit an hour debate. It's been a real pleasure. There have been a lot of positive comments, and there's a lot of negative comments, but there have been
as expected.
So really, really thank you. I'll be dropping the links to Adar's channel in the description. It's Sulha. It's on YouTube. It's in the chat already, but I will make sure that it's in the description. So anyone who wants to go and watch more of the conversations with either Adar or his guests, and they can go find them there. So
Thank you so much, Joseph.
Okay, pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks, everyone. See you soon.